Have you ever found yourself clinging to something long after it was gone? A memory, a relationship, a moment you wished could last forever, or maybe it's a grudge you've carried for years, a regret that haunts your quiet moments, a fear of losing what you think you need to be happy. If you're human, and if you're listening to this, you most certainly are, you've experienced the invisible chains of attachment. We hold on, tightly, desperately, to people, to ideas, to our image of who we think we are, or who we believe we should be, and yet life keeps moving, the seasons change, loved ones grow old, the things we treasure slip through our fingers, no matter how hard we try to grasp them. And somewhere deep inside, we suffer. In Buddhism, this is called attachment, and it's not a minor flaw in our character, it's the root of all suffering. The Buddha taught over 2,500 years ago that the human tendency to cling to people, experiences, outcomes, and even to our very sense of self, is what keeps us trapped in a cycle of stress, anxiety, and dissatisfaction. Think about it for a moment. How much of your suffering comes from resisting what is, and desperately trying to hold on to what was, or to control what might be? A relationship ends, and we refuse to let go, a job opportunity is lost, and we replay it over and over in our minds. We crave success, security, recognition, believing that once we have it, we'll finally be at peace. But peace doesn't come from holding on, it comes from letting go. Now, let's be clear, Buddhism doesn't ask us to give up life, it asks us to give up our attachment to life being a certain way. It doesn't mean you stop loving people, or stop caring about your dreams. It means you learn to embrace each moment fully, and release it when it's time. To love without possession, to hope without expectation, to engage without clinging. It means recognizing that everything in life is temporary, and fighting that reality only brings pain. There's an old Zen saying, let go, or be dragged, and isn't that what we do so often? We get dragged by our memories, our desires, our fears, and we wonder why we feel so exhausted. What if we could loosen our grip just a little? What if we could learn to live more lightly, without these invisible chains weighing us down? That's what this journey is about. In this series, we'll explore why Buddhism places such profound emphasis on letting go, not as an act of defeat, but as an act of freedom. Not as giving up on life, but as choosing to experience it more fully, without the constant burden of clinging. We'll unravel the nature of attachment, understand why it causes so much suffering, and discover how letting go can open the doorway to a quieter, lighter, and freer way of being. Because at the heart of it all, the question isn't whether life will change, it will. People will come and go, opportunities will rise and fade, bodies will age, fortunes will turn. The question is, how will you meet those moments? Will you resist and cling? Or will you soften, accept, and let go? Have you ever noticed how the things we hold on to the tightest are often the very things that cause us the most pain? A relationship we refuse to let end, a version of ourselves we can't admit is gone, a future we obsess over, even though it hasn't arrived, and may never look the way we imagined. It's a strange thing about human nature. We know everything is temporary, yet we live as if it's not. Buddhism calls this attachment, and it isn't love, it isn't care, it's the clinging, the desperate need for something or someone to stay, to last, to be a certain way. And here's the truth, attachment hurts because it fights against the very nature of reality. You see, the Buddha taught what's known as the Four Noble Truths, a timeless framework for understanding why we suffer, and how to end that suffering. And at the heart of this wisdom is one crucial insight: the cause of suffering is craving and clinging. In Pali, the ancient language of the Buddhist teachings, it's called tanha, an insatiable thirst, a constant wanting. We chase pleasure, we avoid pain, we cling to things we like, we push away the things we don't, and in that endless cycle of grasping and resisting, we suffer. Imagine holding a burning coal in your hand. You know it's searing your skin, you can feel the pain, and yet, you refuse to let it go, because it once kept you warm. That's what attachment is like. The things we cling to may have once brought us joy, comfort, or meaning, but when their time has passed, holding on only burns us. Attachment isn't just about material things, it's about identities, beliefs, expectations, ideas about how life should be. We cling to being successful. We cling to being a good person. We cling to the idea that if we just have this, achieve that, or become this, we'll finally be at peace. But peace isn't found in achieving a perfect version of life. It's found in releasing our need for life to be perfect. Think about it. How often do we get angry not because of what someone did, but because it wasn't what we expected? How often do we feel hurt not by reality, but by our resistance to it? A friend forgets your birthday, a plan falls apart, a person you love chooses a different path. It's not the event itself that causes suffering, it's our attachment to how we wanted it to be. In Buddhism, this truth is so fundamental that it forms the very core of the practice. It teaches us that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Yes, you'll lose people. Yes, things will end. Yes, life will throw you moments of heartbreak, disappointment, and uncertainty. But whether those moments turn into lasting suffering depends on whether you cling to them. The good news, you can train your mind to see this, to catch yourself in the act of clinging, to notice when you're gripping life too tightly, and soften your hold. It starts by observing the mind. Notice when you're replaying a conversation that's already over. Notice when you're obsessing about a future that hasn't arrived. Notice when you feel yourself tensing up, grasping for control. Approval, or certainty, that's attachment at work, and the moment you see it, you create a space, a tiny opening between stimulus and reaction, a chance to choose freedom over suffering. This is what the Buddha meant when he spoke of liberation, not a life without pain, but a life without unnecessary chains, a life where joy isn't dependent on conditions, where peace isn't held hostage by things outside yourself, where you can fully love and still let go, where you can fully engage and still remain free. Letting go, we hear those words so often, in books, on social media, in advice from well-meaning friends. You just need to let it go. But what does that actually mean? Does it mean pretending not to care? Does it mean giving up on the things and people you love, or becoming cold, detached, indifferent to the world around you? That's the fear, isn't it? The fear that if we stop clinging, we'll stop feeling, that without attachment, life will become empty, dull, or meaningless. But Buddhism teaches something radically different. Letting go isn't about shutting down your heart, it's about opening it wider than ever before. It isn't about loving less, it's about loving more purely, without the heavy chains of expectation and control. It's not about withdrawing from life, it's about engaging with life more fully, more honestly, without needing it to match a script you've written in your mind. In Buddhist teachings, letting go means releasing the mental and emotional grasp we have on things being a certain way. It's the gentle, courageous act of loosening your grip on the thoughts, stories, and expectations that cause you to suffer, not because those things don't matter, but because clinging to them tightens the knot of suffering in your heart. It's like holding water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the more it slips through your fingers, but if you relax your grip, you can hold it with ease, for as long as it's meant to be there. Letting go means allowing people to be who they are, allowing moments to come and go, allowing yourself to change, to age, to make mistakes, and to grow. It means no longer tying your peace to whether someone approves of you, or whether your plan unfolds exactly as you imagined, or whether life cooperates with your every wish. It's not about becoming passive or indifferent, it's about being fully present with what's here, without needing to possess it. To love someone deeply, and still know you cannot own them, to pursue a goal with passion, and still understand its outcome isn't your true source of peace. It's choosing to live with an open palm, not a clenched fist. The Buddha described attachment as a kind of thirst, a craving that keeps us reaching, grasping, and aching for more. And like any thirst, the more we chase after things to quench it, the more insatiable it becomes. But letting go, that's like finally setting down a heavy burden you've carried for miles. It doesn't mean you lose the things you care about, it means you no longer suffer because of them. Imagine loving someone without the silent contract that they must stay. Imagine pursuing a dream without the unbearable pressure that your happiness depends on its success. Imagine looking in the mirror and not clinging to the idea of who you used to be, or who you think you should become. That's freedom, not the freedom to escape life, but the freedom to live it. In Buddhism, This freedom is called nirvana. It's not a place you go, it's a state of being, a mind no longer enslaved by attachment and aversion. A heart so open, it can hold joy and sorrow, gain and loss, love and letting go, without breaking. One of the most beautiful teachings in Zen Buddhism says, when you let go of what you are, you become what you might be, because every moment you cling, you limit yourself, you shrink your world to the size of your desires and fears, but when you release those limits, you become vast, spacious, unbound. You discover a love that isn't dependent on how people behave, a peace that isn't conditional on circumstances, and a sense of self that isn't tethered to labels, achievements, or approval. Now, I know this isn't easy. Letting go sounds simple, but it's one of the most difficult, and most courageous, acts we can perform. Because it requires trust, trust in the impermanence of life, trust in your ability to face change without falling apart, trust that you can experience loss without losing yourself. It asks you to soften your grip in a world that tells you to hold tight, to choose peace when your ego demands control, to find stillness in the midst of uncertainty. But here's the secret, every time you let go, even a little, you taste freedom. And that freedom is addictive in the best way, not the kind that numbs you to life, the kind that makes you feel more alive than ever. Have you ever noticed how nothing ever stays the same? Seasons shift, people come and go, our bodies age, our moods rise and fall, and what once seemed so important slowly fades into memory. Life, by its very nature, is in constant motion, and yet most of us spend our days resisting this truth. We want to freeze the beautiful moments, hold on to the people we love, keep the things we value untouched, as if we could somehow outrun time. But we can't, and it's not a flaw in the system, it is the system. Buddhism has a word for this, anicca, impermanence. It's one of the three marks of existence, alongside suffering and the absence of a permanent, unchanging self. The Buddha saw that everything that arises will pass away, every experience, every feeling, every person, even you, and rather than this being a source of despair, he taught that it's the key to peace. Why? Because when you truly understand that nothing lasts forever, you stop clinging so tightly, you begin to cherish what you have while it's here, without the desperation to make it stay. You realize that pain, like a storm, will eventually pass, that joy, like a sunrise, will fade, and that's okay, because another sunrise will follow. Soft instrumental builds gently. Impermanence isn't a problem to solve, it's a truth to embrace. When you fight against it, you suffer. When you move with it, you find freedom. Think about the ocean, its waves rise and fall without resistance. The tide comes in, and the tide goes out, and no single wave tries to hold its place. Your life is like that, a series of waves, moments, emotions, people, all coming and going. But here's what most of us do: when something good happens, we grasp it, we attach our happiness to it, and when it leaves, as it inevitably will, we mourn its loss, believing something has gone wrong. But nothing went wrong. That's the nature of waves. When you understand impermanence, you begin to ride those waves with grace. You stop being thrown around by every high and low. You stop expecting permanence in a world designed for change. The Buddha taught that clinging to what's impermanent is like trying to build a house on a riverbank. The water will rise, the earth will shift, and eventually, no matter how strong your walls are, it will wash away. The wise don't waste their energy resisting this truth. They learn to flow with it. This isn't about giving up on life, or detaching from joy. It's about being fully present for what's here, while it's here, to love deeply. Knowing that love may one day take a different form, to savor every breath, every sunrise, every laugh with a friend, not because you can keep them, but because you can't, and when they pass, to let them go with gratitude. There's a story in Buddhist tradition about a king who asked his sages to find a phrase that would bring him peace in times of trouble, and humility in times of triumph. After much thought, they returned with these simple words: "This too shall pass." Those words carry the essence of impermanence, a reminder that no matter how dark the night, dawn will come, and no matter how bright the day, night will fall. Understanding impermanence softens our grip on life. It makes us kinder, because we know the people we love won't be here forever. It makes us patient, because we trust that difficult moments will pass. It makes us brave, because we realize there's no sense in waiting for perfect conditions, they don't exist. This is why Buddhist monks meditate in cemeteries, why they contemplate death, not to be morbid, but to wake up, to remember how precious every moment is, precisely because it won't last. And here's a secret: the more you accept impermanence, the more joy you'll feel, because you'll stop chasing after things you can't control, you'll start savoring what's right in front of you, and you'll discover a freedom not bound by circumstances. Letting go sounds beautiful in theory. It's easy to nod along when we're sitting in meditation, or listening to a wise teacher speak of impermanence. But what about when you're stuck in traffic, running late to an important meeting, or when someone you love says something hurtful, when the relationship you hoped would last forever begins to fade, when your carefully made plans fall apart in the blink of an eye? That's where the real practice begins. You see, Buddhism isn't meant to be locked away in temples or ancient texts. It's a living wisdom, meant to be carried into the messy, unpredictable, beautiful chaos of everyday life. And in those moments, when your patience is tested, when your heart feels heavy, when life refuses to follow your script, you have a choice: to grip tighter, or to let go. Letting go in daily life doesn't mean walking away from your responsibilities, or pretending things don't matter. It means releasing the mental and emotional grip that turns life's natural ups and downs into suffering. It's the small, silent decisions you make every day. Like choosing not to replay that argument in your head for the 100th time, or releasing the need for your partner to always agree with you, or setting down the impossible expectation that you should be perfect all the time. One of the simplest and most powerful practices in Buddhism is mindful awareness. It's noticing, in real time, when you're clinging, noticing when you're holding on to a thought, a belief, an expectation, or a fear, and then, gently, choosing to loosen your grip. Like when you catch yourself spiraling in worry about the future, and instead, bring your attention back to your breath, or when you feel jealousy rise in your chest, and recognize it as a passing emotion, not a permanent truth, or when you're stuck in traffic, realizing you can either curse at the cars ahead, or turn on your favorite song and let it be. Letting go happens in these ordinary moments. It's in the forgiveness you offer, even when no apology comes. It's in the deep breath you take before reacting in anger. It's in accepting that sometimes, people won't understand you, and that's okay. It's not dramatic. It's not always Instagram-worthy, but it's deeply, quietly life-changing. The Buddha taught that suffering doesn't come from what happens to us, it comes from how tightly we cling to how we think things should be. When you release that grip, even a little, you create space, space to breathe, space to choose a different response, space for peace to enter. There's a Zen story about two monks traveling together. They came to a river where a young woman stood, unable to cross. In their tradition, monks weren't supposed to touch women, but without hesitation, the older monk picked her up and carried her across the water. Later, as they walked in silence, the younger monk fumed. Finally, he burst out, "How could you do that? You know we're not allowed to touch women." The older monk smiled gently. "I put her down hours ago," he said. "Why are you still carrying her? That's what we do, isn't it? We carry things long after the moment has passed, old resentments, words we wish we could unsay, mistakes we made years ago, grudges against people who don't even remember what they did. But every burden we carry weighs us down. Letting go means putting them down, not because those experiences didn't matter, but because carrying them is costing you your peace in daily life. This might look like journaling out your frustrations instead of bottling them up. It might mean pausing before reacting to ask yourself, will this matter in a year? In a week? Even tomorrow? Sometimes, it means setting boundaries, not to control others, but to honor your own peace. And sometimes, it means forgiving yourself for the 1,000 little ways you fall short, and remembering that being human is a messy, imperfect, beautiful thing. Letting go isn't a one-time event, it's a practice, a daily, moment-by-moment choice. Some days, you'll do it with grace, other days, you'll cling a little too tight, and that's okay. The practice is in noticing, in softening, in trying again. You might start by choosing one thing today. Maybe it's letting go of needing your day to unfold perfectly. maybe it's releasing the story that says you're not enough, maybe it's forgiving someone. Not because they asked, but because you're ready to stop suffering, whatever it is. Start there, because every small act of letting go is a step toward freedom. Have you ever felt trapped, like no matter what you do, the same worries, fears, and patterns keep circling back, like there's an invisible cage around your heart and mind, and the key is nowhere to be found? That's the weight of attachment. Attachment can feel like love, desire, or even hope, but beneath it lies a hidden thread, a need to control, to hold on, to avoid loss at any cost. Buddhism offers us a way out of this cage. A path not of denial, but of deep understanding and transformation. This path leads from attachment, the root of suffering, to freedom, to liberation. Liberation doesn't mean renouncing the world or shutting down your feelings, it means waking up to the truth of how things really are. It means seeing your attachments clearly, like clouds drifting in the sky, not clinging to them, not pushing them away, just noticing, and gently, bit by bit, loosening their hold. This path is what the Buddha called the Noble Eightfold Path, a guide to living wisely, ethically, and mindfully. It starts with right understanding, seeing the impermanent, interconnected nature of all things. From there, it flows into right intention, cultivating kindness, compassion, and letting go of harmful desires. It continues with right speech, right action, and right livelihood, ways of living that don't deepen attachment or cause harm, and finally, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, the tools to train your mind to be free. But what does this look like in practice? Imagine a bird in a cage. The cage is your attachments, your cravings, your fears, your fixed ideas of who you are and what life should be. The bird is your true self, wild, free, and radiant. The path of liberation isn't about forcing the cage open or beating on the bars, it's about understanding why the cage exists in the first place, why we build walls around ourselves to protect what we love, even when those walls trap us. You start by opening the door gently, with awareness, noticing the stories you tell yourself that keep the cage locked tight. I need this to be happy. If I lose this, I will fall apart. I must control everything to feel safe. These stories are powerful, but they're not the truth. Buddhism teaches that our true nature is already free. The cage is made of illusions, the attachments and aversions we've collected over time. When you practice meditation and mindfulness, you begin to see these illusions for what they are, not solid, unbreakable chains, but clouds that rise and fade. And as you let go of one attachment after another, something incredible happens. You feel lighter, your mind becomes clearer, your heart opens wider. You realize that freedom isn't a distant dream, it's right here, in this moment. The path from attachment to freedom is not always easy. It requires courage, patience, and gentle persistence. There will be moments when you stumble, when the cage feels tightest, when the old habits call you back. But with every small step, you reclaim your freedom. This is the journey of awakening, of becoming truly alive. Not by holding on, but by learning to let go. And when you do, you discover a peace deeper than any circumstance, a joy that doesn't depend on things going your way, a love that flows freely, without conditions or chains. We've journeyed together through the hidden chains that bind us, the nature of attachment that causes pain, and the gentle art of letting go that leads to true freedom. Now, as we come to the close of this exploration, let's pause and breathe in the lightness that arises when we live without attachments. Living without attachments doesn't mean living without love. It means loving freely, without expectation, without possession, without fear. It means opening your heart wide to the world, and trusting that life will flow as it must. There is a profound lightness in this way of being, a lightness that lifts the weight of worry, regret, and grasping. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack filled with all your fears, your what-ifs, your should-haves. Now imagine setting that backpack down, and feeling the relief, the ease, the spaciousness. That's the gift of letting go. Buddhism invites us to walk this path every day, not perfectly, but sincerely, not as a destination, but as a lifelong journey. Each moment is a new chance to loosen the grip, to soften the heart, and to live with a freedom that doesn't depend on circumstances. When you embrace this lightness, your relationships transform, you love more deeply because you don't cling, you connect more fully because you don't possess, you forgive more easily because you understand the impermanence of all things, and most importantly, you find peace, a peace that shines from within, unshaken by the storms of life. So, as you go forward, remember this: letting go is not losing, it's gaining the freedom to be who you truly are, to live fully, love openly, and move through life with grace. If this journey into the art of letting go has touched your heart, if you feel inspired to explore more about Buddhist wisdom and mindful living, please like, subscribe, and share this video with those who might benefit. Your support helps us build a community of seekers and sharers, people committed to awakening, peace, and freedom. Thank you for walking this path with me. May your days be filled with lightness, love, and endless freedom. Until next time, be well, and keep letting go.